People think the most dangerous men never let their guard down. They're wrong. The real mystery is who they choose to trust. If someone had told me that the world's most feared Alpha Mafia boss would fall asleep on my shoulder during the last train home, I would have laughed, thanked them for the strange joke, and gone back to organizing returned library books. My life had always been painfully ordinary. I worked the evening shift at the Haven District Public Library, spent my weekends buying discounted groceries, and measured success by whether my apartment's old radiator decided to cooperate before midnight. Nothing about me belonged in whispered legends or newspaper headlines. Yet there I was, sitting in the nearly empty subway car at 11:43 on a rainy Thursday, wearing a faded gray hoodie that still smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, when the man beside me closed his eyes and slowly leaned against my shoulder as though it were the safest place in the world. At first, I thought he was simply exhausted. His charcoal overcoat looked expensive enough to pay my rent for a year, but exhaustion doesn't care about money. Dark hair brushed his forehead, and the tension that had been carved into his face seemed to meld away with every steady breath. I glanced around, expecting someone to wake him, but instead I found something far stranger. Every passenger in the car had become perfectly still. A businessman froze with his phone halfway to his ear. An elderly woman clutched her shopping bag without blinking. Even a teenager who had been listening to music lowered his headphones in complete silence. It wasn't the awkward quiet of strangers sharing public transportation. It was the heavy silence of people who suddenly believed that making the wrong move could change everything. I frowned, confused. Maybe he was a celebrity. Maybe some famous politician. I honestly had no idea. I had a habit of ignoring the news unless it involved weather warnings or changes to the subway schedule. The train rolled through another tunnel, its windows reflecting pale streaks of fluorescent light. The stranger shifted slightly, settling more comfortably against me. His breathing remained calm, deep, almost peaceful. Without thinking, I adjusted my position just enough to keep his neck from resting at an awkward angle. My mother had always told me that if someone was finally getting real sleep, you shouldn't wake them unless you absolutely had to. Across the aisle, a tall man wearing a perfectly fitted black suit stared directly at me. An earpiece disappeared beneath his collar, and one hand remained inside his jacket as though waiting for instructions only he could hear. Beside him stood another man with the same composed expression, watching every tiny movement I made. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them blinked. They simply waited. I swallowed quietly and looked back at the sleeping stranger. There was something unusual about him beyond the tailored clothes and impossibly calm expression. For the first time since he had leaned against me, I noticed that despite the crowded scent of rain, metal, and old upholstery filling the subway car, the air around him carried the clean fragrance of cedar after a winter storm. It was subtle, strangely comforting, and completely out of place underground. The train announced the next station over the speakers, but no one stood to leave. No one dared interrupt the impossible scene unfolding before them. I had no way of knowing that the man sleeping beside me was Damian Blackwood, the Alpha every newspaper refused to photograph up close, the name spoken only in careful whispers behind closed doors. I only knew that, for reasons I couldn't begin to understand, a complete stranger who looked like he hadn't truly rested in years had finally found enough peace to close his eyes beside someone as ordinary as me. The train eased away from the station with a low metallic hum, carrying its impossible silence deeper into the sleeping city. I kept staring at the reflection in the dark window instead of the man resting against me, because looking directly at him somehow felt impolite. His breathing remained slow and even, the kind that only came with complete trust or complete exhaustion. Neither explanation made sense. The two men in black suits had not taken their eyes off us for a single second. Every few moments they exchanged almost invisible glances, as though carrying on an entire conversation without speaking. I wondered if they were bodyguards. If they were the strangest bodyguards I had ever seen. They looked less concerned that their employer had fallen asleep than they did about how everyone else might react. The woman across the aisle quietly reached for her purse, then seemed to reconsider and slowly rested both hands on her lap instead. The businessman finally lowered his phone without making the call he had been preparing to make. It felt as though the entire subway car had silently agreed to protect one sleeping passenger. That thought almost made me smile. I carefully shifted my backpack off my knees so it would not slide into the stranger's arm if the train jerked unexpectedly. His head settled a fraction closer, and for just an instant the tension disappeared from his brow completely. Whoever he was, he carried a weight that did not belong on any single person. I recognized that expression because I had seen it reflected in library windows after closing time whenever another month ended with barely enough money left to cover rent. People carried invisible burdens more often than anyone realized. Mine just happened to be easier to hide. The overhead speaker announced another stop. The doors opened with a soft chime, yet nobody entered our car even though several people stood on the platform. They looked inside, hesitated, then quietly chose another car instead. I frowned. That was odd. New York commuters usually ignored everything around them. Tonight, people were avoiding this car on purpose. Before I could think about it any longer, one of the suited men finally moved. He stepped forward with careful precision until he stood only a few feet away. His expression remained perfectly controlled, but there was unmistakable respect in the way he looked toward the sleeping man. Then, to my complete surprise, he gave me the smallest shake of his head, silently asking me not to wake him. I blinked in confusion but gave an uncertain nod. It seemed like the polite thing to do. The man inclined his head in gratitude before returning to his place without saying a single word. The exchange lasted no more than 3 seconds, yet somehow it felt unusually significant. My phone buzzed inside my pocket with a reminder that tomorrow morning I needed to return early to catalog a shipment of donated books. I silenced the notification before it could make another sound. The stranger never stirred. Outside, the rain continued tracing silver lines across the windows as the city lights blurred into glowing ribbons. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed through the streets, fading almost as quickly as it appeared. The peaceful rhythm of the man beside me never changed. Then, just as I began wondering whether he would sleep until the end of the line, he quietly spoke without opening his eyes. His voice was low, steady, and almost impossible to hear above the tracks. "Do not leave when the train stops." The words were calm, almost gentle, but they carried the certainty of someone who had never expected to be ignored. Before I could ask what he meant, he fell silent again, still asleep, leaving me to wonder whether I had truly heard him at all. For a long moment, I wondered if I had imagined the words. The steady rhythm of the train, the endless rain sliding across the windows, and the strange silence surrounding us could easily have played tricks on an exhausted mind. I looked down at the man resting against my shoulder. His eyes were still closed. His breathing had not changed. If I had not heard his quiet voice only seconds earlier, I would have believed he was still completely asleep. My stop was only 2 stations away. I had followed the same route home for almost 3 years without missing it once. My apartment was 6 blocks from the station, and tomorrow promised another ordinary day of sorting donated books, repairing worn bindings, and helping children find adventure stories hidden on dusty shelves. That predictable routine suddenly felt impossibly far away. The train slowed as it approached the next platform. Bright station lights spilled through the windows, washing pale reflections across the polished floor. The electronic announcement echoed through the car, followed by the familiar chime of opening doors. I instinctively reached for my backpack. Before I could stand, one of the suited men met my eyes and gave another almost invisible shake of his head. It was not a threat. It was closer to a plea. I hesitated. The sleeping stranger had asked me not to leave. The bodyguard had silently repeated the same request. None of it made any sense, yet curiosity rooted me to the seat. The doors slid closed again, and the train continued forward. My stop disappeared behind us. I let out a quiet breath, wondering what excuse I would give my landlord if I arrived home much later than usual. Across the aisle, the elderly woman offered me a gentle smile, the first expression I had seen from anyone since this strange journey began. She leaned forward only slightly and whispered so softly I almost missed it. "Young man, whatever happens tonight, stay calm." Before I could respond, she leaned back as though she had never spoken. My confusion deepened. How did everyone seem to know something that I did not? The stranger beside me shifted once more, his hand relaxing against the sleeve of his overcoat. Under the bright station lights, I noticed several faint silver scars crossing his knuckles, old enough to have faded with time. They were not the hands of someone who spent every day behind a desk. despite the elegance of his clothes. They belonged to someone who had lived through years of responsibility, difficult choices, and countless sleepless nights. His expression remained unexpectedly peaceful. It occurred to me that perhaps this was the first uninterrupted rest he had enjoyed in a very long time. I quietly removed my folded scarf from my backpack and placed it between his head and the hard metal wall beside the window, so he would be more comfortable if the train jolted. One of the suited men noticed the small gesture. His normally unreadable face softened for only a heartbeat before returning to its professional calm. He gave me a respectful nod that felt strangely sincere. No one had ever thanked me without words before. Several more minutes passed. Then every phone inside the subway car vibrated at exactly the same moment. The businessman glanced at his screen and immediately turned pale. The teenager lowered his eyes after reading the notification. Even the bodyguards checked their devices with unusual urgency. Mine buzzed as well. Expecting another reminder from work, I unlocked the screen. Instead, every news application displayed the same breaking headline. The city's most elusive business leader, Damian Blackwood, had disappeared nearly 1 hour earlier, and authorities had no confirmed information about his whereabouts. My heartbeat stopped for a single terrifying second before I slowly turned toward the man who was still peacefully asleep on my shoulder. The words on my phone blurred for a moment before snapping back into focus. Damian Blackwood. The name alone carried enough weight that even someone like me, who rarely paid attention to headlines, recognized it immediately. Newspapers called him an untouchable businessman. Financial magazines described him as a mysterious billionaire who never attended interviews and almost never appeared in public. Online rumors painted an entirely different picture, whispering about invisible networks of influence that reached every corner of the city. I had always dismissed those stories as exaggerated legends people invented to explain success they could not understand. Yet the photograph attached to the breaking news left no room for doubt. The man peacefully sleeping beside me was the same man looking back from the screen, except the photo captured none of what I was seeing now. In every published image, Damian Blackwood looked distant, unreadable, almost carved from stone. The man leaning against my shoulder looked tired. Not weak, not helpless, simply tired in a way that seemed deeply human. I lowered my phone before the light could disturb him. Around the subway car, every passenger quietly put their own devices away as though an unspoken agreement had been reached. No one whispered his name. No one reached for a camera. No one attempted to record the impossible scene unfolding before them. It struck me as unusual in a world where people documented everything. Somehow everyone instinctively understood that this moment did not belong on the internet. The train continued through another tunnel, the lights briefly flickering against the dark glass. One of the bodyguards stepped closer again, this time stopping beside my seat. His voice was calm, respectful, and barely louder than the wheels beneath us. "Thank you for not waking him." I looked up, still trying to process everything. "Does this happen often?" He held my gaze for a second before giving the smallest smile I had seen all night. "Never." The single word settled heavily in my mind. Never. Not rarely. Not occasionally. Never. Before I could ask another question, he quietly returned to his position near the door. My curiosity only grew stronger. What kind of life forced a man to go so many years without feeling safe enough to fall asleep? My grandmother used to tell me that true rest could never be purchased, borrowed, or demanded. It was a gift the heart accepted only when it believed tomorrow would still exist. Looking at Damien now, I wondered when he had last received that gift. His breathing remained steady. His shoulders no longer carried the rigid tension I had noticed earlier. For the first time since we met, his expression softened into something almost peaceful, and I realized he looked younger than the photograph suggested. The invisible armor he wore while awake seemed to have disappeared entirely. Suddenly the train began slowing once again, but this station felt different. Through the windows, I noticed several black vehicles waiting beyond the platform entrance. Men and women dressed in dark suits stood quietly beneath the fluorescent lights, their attention fixed on the arriving train. None of them appeared impatient. Instead, they watched with remarkable discipline, as though they had been instructed that whatever happened next depended on one simple condition. The train came to a gentle stop. The doors opened, yet not a single one of them stepped inside. They remained exactly where they were, waiting with extraordinary patience for one sleeping man to wake up on his own. The train remained motionless at the platform long after the doors had opened, yet no announcement explained the delay and no impatient voices complained. It was as if the entire schedule of the city had quietly bent around a single sleeping passenger. The people waiting outside stood in perfect order beneath the bright station lights, their attention fixed on the subway car, without taking a single step forward. I had never witnessed discipline like that before. It did not feel forced. It felt earned. I glanced at the bodyguard who had spoken to me earlier. His eyes never left Damien, but there was something different in his expression now. Relief. Not complete relief, but enough that I could recognize it. Whoever these people were, they had been worried about far more than a delayed train. I looked back at the man resting against my shoulder. The steady rise and fall of his breathing had not changed since he closed his eyes. His face remained calm, untouched by the pressure that seemed to follow him everywhere else. For reasons I could not explain, I found myself hoping nobody would interrupt him. The thought surprised me. Less than an hour earlier, he had been a complete stranger. Now I felt oddly protective of the quiet moment he had somehow found beside me. My phone buzzed again with another news update, but I ignored it without reading the screen. The headlines suddenly felt less important than the reality sitting inches away. Across the aisle, the elderly woman slowly gathered her shopping bags and smiled at me once more. "Kindness always finds its way back," she whispered before the doors gently closed again. This time she stepped into the next car through the connecting door, disappearing without another word. I watched her leave, wondering if I would ever see her again. As the train began moving once more, the bodyguard finally approached my seat for a second time. "My name is Lucas," he said quietly. "I owe you an explanation, even if it cannot be a complete one." I nodded, unsure whether I was ready for any explanation. Lucas looked toward Damien before continuing. "He has not slept peacefully in many years. Doctors could not explain it. Specialists could not change it. Every place we prepared became another place where he remained awake." His voice carried neither frustration nor exaggeration. It sounded like someone stating a simple fact that had been accepted long ago. Tonight was different. I searched Damien's peaceful face again. "Because of me?" I asked before realizing how impossible the question sounded. Lucas considered his answer carefully. "We do not know why," he admitted. "We only know that the moment he sat beside you." He closed his eyes for the first time without hesitation. The words settled over me with unexpected weight. I was an ordinary library assistant who spent evenings repairing damaged novels with careful hands and quiet patience. There was nothing extraordinary about me. Nothing that should matter to someone whose name appeared on every breaking news alert in the city. Yet the evidence was impossible to ignore. Lucas reached into his coat pocket, removed a small business card, and carefully placed it beside my backpack instead of handing it directly to me. "You are under no obligation," he said with genuine respect. "When tonight ends, you may walk away and forget every face you have seen. No one will stop you. But if you ever wish to understand why this happened, there will always be someone waiting to answer the questions that only began the moment he chose your shoulder instead of the empty seat beside him." At that exact moment, Damien slowly opened his eyes, not with alarm or confusion, but with the quiet expression of someone waking from the first truly restful sleep he could remember. Damien opened his eyes slowly, as though he expected the familiar weight of another restless night to be waiting for him. Instead, he remained perfectly still, taking one quiet breath before another. His gaze drifted toward the subway window, then to the nearly empty car, and finally settled on me. For several long seconds, he simply looked at me without speaking. There was no suspicion in his expression, no cold calculation, only genuine surprise. It was the kind of look someone wore after waking from a dream they had never believed could exist. He straightened carefully, immediately noticing the folded scarf I had placed between his head and the metal wall. His fingertips rested on the soft fabric for a moment before he turned toward me again. "Did you do this?" he asked in a calm voice. I nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I thought it might make your neck hurt less." He looked down at the scarf once more before offering a quiet smile that transformed his entire face. Every photograph I had ever seen of Damien Blackwood had captured authority, distance, and absolute control. None of them had ever shown this expression. "Thank you, Ethan," he said. My heart skipped. I had never told him my name. Lucas noticed my reaction immediately, but remained silent. Damien seemed to understand the question before I asked it. Your library identification card slipped out of your backpack while you adjusted your seat, he explained gently. I happened to notice it before I fell asleep. I glanced at the edge of my backpack where the plastic card was indeed partially visible and laughed softly at my own imagination. That makes much more sense than whatever I was about to believe. To my surprise, Damien laughed as well. It was quiet, warm, and completely unlike the intimidating public image attached to his name. Even Lucas blinked, as though hearing that sound was something extraordinarily rare. The atmosphere inside the subway car shifted almost instantly. The tension that had held everyone silent for the past hour slowly dissolved. Passengers began breathing normally again. Someone cleared their throat. Another person quietly picked up a newspaper from the empty seat beside them. It felt as though the entire car had been waiting for Damien to wake peacefully before allowing the world to continue turning. Damien leaned back slightly, stretching one shoulder with an expression of mild disbelief. How long? He asked Lucas. Just over 1 hour, Lucas replied. Damien closed his eyes briefly, almost smiling to himself. 1 hour, he repeated in a whisper. I cannot remember the last time I rested for even 15 minutes. There was no pride in his voice, only quiet amazement. He looked toward me again. Did I inconvenience you? I shook my head. I missed my stop. His expression immediately became apologetic. I am sorry. The sincerity in those 2 words caught me completely off guard. People with his reputation were not supposed to apologize to strangers over something so small. It is only another train ride home, I answered. It is not a big problem. Damien studied me thoughtfully, as though weighing every word I had spoken since we met. Outside the windows, the city lights continued slipping past in golden reflections. Then he asked a question so unexpectedly simple that it erased every headline, every rumor, and every story I had ever heard about him. Ethan, he said quietly, would you tell me what you were thinking while I was asleep? For reasons I could not explain, it felt like the most important question anyone had ever asked me. For a moment, I could only stare at him, wondering why that question mattered more than everything else that had happened tonight. I searched for the clever answer he probably expected from someone sitting across from a man whose name carried enough influence to move markets and dominate headlines, but nothing clever came. Honestly, I said, I was thinking that you looked like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to rest. Damien did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on mine, not with surprise, but with quiet reflection. It was almost as though I had spoken words he had been unable to say to himself. Around us, the subway continued its steady journey beneath the city, yet the world inside our car seemed to exist at a different pace. Lucas and the other security team remained respectfully distant, allowing the conversation to unfold without interruption. Damien looked down at his hands for a brief moment before speaking again. Most people tell me I look confident, he said. Some say intimidating. Others say impossible to approach. No one has ever told me I looked tired. I smiled faintly. That is probably because they were looking at your reputation instead of your face. A quiet laugh escaped him once again, softer than before, but no less genuine. Perhaps you are right. He leaned back against the seat and glanced out the window where rain continued streaking across the glass in silver lines. Do you know what I dreamed about? He asked. I shook my head. Nothing extraordinary, he replied. I dreamed about walking through a bookstore with my mother when I was a child. She kept stopping to recommend stories she thought I would enjoy. I had forgotten that memory completely. His voice carried neither sadness nor regret, only gratitude for remembering something precious that time had nearly erased. Dreams like that have not visited me in years. I listened quietly, realizing that beneath the carefully crafted image the public knew stood someone who still treasured simple moments from long ago. It reminded me that every person, no matter how powerful, carried memories that money and influence could never replace. The train entered another station, but this time Damien made no move to stand. Instead, he turned toward Lucas. Cancel tomorrow morning's first meeting. Lucas blinked in surprise. Sir, reschedule it, Damien said calmly. For the first time in years, I woke up with a clear mind instead of exhaustion. I intend to keep that feeling for at least a few more hours. Lucas nodded almost immediately, though the request clearly caught him off guard. He quietly stepped away to send several messages. Damien noticed my curious expression and smiled. My staff is not accustomed to me changing plans. I can see that, I replied. He folded his hands together thoughtfully before asking another unexpected question. What were you planning to do tomorrow before all of this happened? I told him about the shipment of donated books waiting to be cataloged, the children's reading program scheduled for the afternoon, and the elderly volunteers who always arrived 30 minutes early because they enjoyed talking before the library opened. As I spoke, Damien listened with complete attention, as though every ordinary detail mattered. When I finished, he remained silent for several seconds before quietly saying, "Your day sounds peaceful." I nodded. Most of the time it is. He looked out at the passing lights once more, then back at me with an expression that mixed curiosity and hope in equal measure. "Ethan," he said softly, "I think tonight may have reminded me that peace is not a place someone builds. Sometimes it is simply a person they never expected to meet." The words lingered between us long after Damien finished speaking. I had no idea how to respond to someone who had just compared peace to a person instead of a place. My life had never inspired dramatic conversations. Most evenings ended with reheated soup, a borrowed novel, and the comforting sound of rain against my apartment window. Yet somehow, in the middle of an ordinary subway ride, I had become part of a moment neither of us could explain. Before I could answer, Lucas's phone vibrated softly. He glanced at the screen, then toward Damien with an expression that suggested he was deciding whether the information could wait. Damien noticed immediately. "Go ahead," he said calmly. Lucas lowered his voice. "Our research team completed the background review you requested." I frowned, realizing they had already investigated me while we were still riding the train. Strangely, I did not feel offended. Considering Damien's position, I suppose caution was simply part of everyday life. Lucas hesitated before continuing. "Everything matches. Employment history, education, financial records, volunteer work, and neighborhood references are completely consistent." He paused again, looking unusually puzzled. "However, there is one detail none of us expected." Damien raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Lucas looked directly at me before answering. 10 years ago, Mr. Brooks participated in a children's literacy program organized by the Blackwood Foundation. My eyes widened. "That cannot be right," I said instinctively. "I remember volunteering at community events during high school, but I never paid attention to who sponsored them." Lucas nodded. "The records include photographs." Damien's expression changed almost immediately. Not alarm, recognition. He held out his hand, and Lucas quietly passed him a tablet displaying an archived image. Damien studied the photograph for several silent seconds before turning the screen toward me. There I was at 16 years old, standing beside a mobile library bus with an armful of donated books and an unmistakably oversized volunteer shirt. I laughed in disbelief. I had forgotten this day completely. Then I noticed someone else in the background. A younger Damien stood several feet away without the tailored suits or public confidence he carried today. He was speaking with event organizers while watching children choose books from folding tables arranged across a neighborhood park. He looked younger, quieter, almost invisible compared to the public figure he would later become. "You were there," I whispered. Damien slowly nodded. "I visited for less than 20 minutes before another meeting." His eyes remained on the old photograph. I remember seeing one volunteer helping a frightened little boy who refused to speak to anyone. My heart skipped. "His name was Noah," I replied without thinking. "He was afraid everyone would laugh because he struggled to read out loud." Damien looked at me with unmistakable surprise. "You remember his name?" I smiled softly. Books mattered to him. People remember the things that matter. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The coincidence felt almost impossible, yet there it was preserved in a forgotten photograph taken a decade earlier. Outside, the rain had finally begun to slow, and faint reflections of the city shimmered across the subway windows. Damien returned the tablet to Lucas without taking his eyes off me. "Perhaps tonight did not begin when we boarded this train," he said quietly. "Perhaps it began years ago, and neither of us realized the story had already started until now." The train finally reached the last station, and for the first time that evening the doors opened without hesitation. Dawn had not yet arrived, but the rain had faded into a light mist that softened the city lights outside. Damien remained seated for another moment, looking at the platform as though he had returned from a journey much longer than a single subway ride. Then he stood, smoothing the sleeve of his overcoat before turning toward me. "I believe I have kept you from home long enough," he said with an apologetic smile. I rose with my backpack slung over one shoulder and picked up the folded scarf that had somehow become part of an unforgettable night. It was not exactly the evening I expected, I admitted, but I cannot say I regret missing my stop. A quiet smile appeared on Damien's face again. Lucas stepped forward, prepared to guide him toward the waiting group outside, yet Damien lifted one hand slightly, asking everyone to wait. Every member of his team immediately stopped where they were. It was another reminder that the influence surrounding him did not come from loud commands, but from absolute trust. We stepped onto the platform together. The cool night air carried the fresh scent of rain instead of the stale air of the subway tunnels. The people waiting nearby lowered their heads respectfully as Damien passed, but no one rushed him. No one interrupted the silence. He turned toward me once more. "Ethan, may I ask one final question?" I nodded. "When I leaned against your shoulder tonight, were you afraid?" I considered the question carefully because it deserved an honest answer. "At first, I was confused," I replied. "Then I noticed how exhausted you looked. After that, I stopped thinking about who you were and started thinking about how uncomfortable the train seats must have been." Damien let out a quiet laugh that echoed gently across the nearly empty platform. Even Lucas smiled without trying to hide it. Damien looked toward the slowly brightening skyline before speaking again. "People spend years trying to impress me," he said. "They memorize facts, prepare speeches, and tell me what they think I want to hear. Tonight you did something no one else has managed to do." He paused, meeting my eyes with calm sincerity. "You treated me like an ordinary person who needed a little kindness." I did not know what to say. To me, that had simply felt natural. Damien reached into his coat pocket and removed the same business card Lucas had left beside my backpack earlier. This time he held it out himself. "There is no obligation attached to this," he said. "If you decide to throw it away, I will understand. If you ever choose to call, I would like to buy you a cup of coffee somewhere without cameras, meetings, or expectations." I accepted the card with a small nod. "I think I would like that." A warm silence settled between us, comfortable enough that neither of us felt the need to fill it with unnecessary words. As I turned to leave, Damien quietly called my name one last time. I looked back. He smiled with the peaceful expression that had first appeared when he woke beside me. "For years," he said, "I believed strength meant never allowing myself to rest. Tonight you reminded me that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is trust someone kind enough to expect nothing in return." I walked toward the station exit with the business card safely tucked into my pocket, believing the extraordinary night had finally come to an end. I did not notice the old security camera mounted above the platform until much later, or the single forgotten photograph it captured of two strangers smiling at each other beneath the station lights. A photograph that would quietly change both of their lives in ways neither of them could possibly imagine.